Alert. A situation in which people are watching for danger and ready to deal with it. For example, on the alert for something.
Answer. To say, write, or do something as a reaction to a question or situation. For example, I repeated the question.
Any. Used to emphasize an adjective or adverb in negative sentences or questions, meaning at all. For example, he wasn't any good at French. Any. Used to emphasize an adjective or adverb in negative sentences or questions, meaning at all. For example, he wasn't any good at French.
Anymore. Often used at the end of negative sentences and at the end of questions, to mean any longer. For example, she doesn't live here anymore. Argument. A conversation or discussion in which two or more people disagree, often angrily. For example, to win/lose an argument. Ask. To say or write something in the form of a question, in order to get information. For example, how old are you, if you don't mind me/my asking?
Blank. An empty space on a printed form or document for you to write answers, information, etc. in. For example, please fill in the blanks.
Capital.
Capital. The most important town or city of a country or region, where the government operates from. For example, Cairo is the capital of Egypt.
Clause. A group of words that includes a subject and a verb, and forms a sentence or part of a sentence. For example, in a clause.
Code. A system of words, letters, numbers, or symbols that represent a message or record information secretly or in a shorter form. For example, to crack a code, equals to understand and read the message.
Contact. To communicate with somebody, for example by phone, letter, or email. For example, I've been trying to contact you all day.
Conversation. An informal talk involving a small group of people, or only two, the activity of talking in this way. For example, a phone conversation.
Correspondence.
Correspondence. The letters, emails, etc. a person sends and receives. For example, personal private correspondence. Date. To write or print the date on something. For example, thank you for your letter dated the 24th of March.
Definition.
Definition. An explanation of the meaning of a word or phrase, especially in a dictionary. For example, the dictionary provides clear.
Deliver.
Deliver. To take goods, letters, etc. to the person or people they have been sent to. For example, deliver something.
Delivery.
Delivery. The act of taking goods, letters, etc. to the people they have been sent to. For example, allow 28 days for delivery.
Deploy. To move soldiers or weapons into a position where they are ready for military action. For example, 2,000 troops were deployed in the area.
Deployment. The act of moving soldiers or weapons into a position where they are ready for military action. For example, the deployment of peacekeeping forces.
Desk. A piece of furniture like a table, often with drawers, equals parts like boxes in it with handles on the front for pulling them open, that you sit at to read, write, work, etc. For example, At a desk.
Dialogue.
Dialogue. A conversation in a book, play or film, or in language teaching materials. For example, learners are asked to listen to 3 short dialogues.
Diary.
Diary. A book in which you can write down the experiences you have each day, your private thoughts, etc. For example, do you keep a diary? Equals write one regularly.
Dictionary.
Dictionary. A book or electronic resource that gives a list of the words of a language in alphabetical order and explains what they mean, or gives a word for them in a foreign language. For example, a Spanish-English dictionary.
Do. Used before a full verb to form negative sentences and questions. For example, I don't like fish.
Draft. To write the first rough version of something such as a letter, speech, book, or law. For example, I'll draft a letter for you.
Economist. A person who studies or writes about economics. For example, the World Bank's chief economist. Elderly. Used as a polite word for old. For example, an elderly man/woman/lady.
Else. In addition to something already mentioned. For example, what else did he say?
Ever. Used in negative sentences and questions, or sentences with if to mean at any time. For example, nothing ever happens here.
Expression. A word or phrase. For example, what's the meaning of the expression on cloud 9?
Extra. More than is usual, expected, or than exists already. For example, extra money cash funding. Extra. More than is usual, expected, or than exists already. For example, extra money cash funding. Ha. Of or belonging to a woman or girl who has already been mentioned or is easily identified. For example, Meg loves her job. Ha. Of or belonging to a woman or girl who has already been mentioned or is easily identified. For example, Meg loves her job. His. Of or belonging to a man or boy who has already been mentioned or is easily identified. For example, James has sold his car.
Historian. A person who studies or writes about history, an expert in history. For example, no serious historian today accepts this theory. I. Used as the subject of a verb when the speaker or writer is referring to himself/herself. For example, I think I'd better go now.
Imagery. Language that produces pictures in the minds of people reading or listening. For example, poetic imagery.
Keyboard.
Keyboard. The set of keys for operating a computer or typewriter, or the set of letters that you can touch to write on a smartphone or tablet. For example, the program locks the keyboard until a password is given.
Label.
Label. To fix a label on something or write information on something. For example, label something.
Letter.
Letter. A written, typed, or printed message that is put in an envelope or attached to an email and sent to somebody. For example, to write send somebody a letter.
Literacy.
Literacy. The ability to read and write. For example, a campaign to promote adult literacy.
Log. To put information in an official record or write a record of events. For example, the police log all phone calls. Lyric. The words of a popular song. For example, music and lyrics by Rodgers and Hart. Mail. The official system used for sending and delivering letters, packages, etc. For example, a mail service/train/van. Many. Used with plural nouns and verbs, especially in negative sentences, or in more formal English, to mean a large number of. Also used in questions to ask about the size of a number, and with as, so, and to. For example, we don't have very many copies left. Many. Used with plural nouns and verbs, especially in negative sentences, or in more formal English, to mean a large number of. Also used in questions to ask about the size of a number, and with as, so, and to. For example, we don't have very many copies left. Mark. To write or draw a symbol, line, etc. on something in order to give information about it. For example, mark something.
Me. The form of I that is used when the speaker or writer is the object of a verb or preposition, or after the verb be. For example, don't hit me.
Mean. To have something as a meaning in the same or another language. For example, mean something. Mention. To write or speak about something/somebody, especially without giving much information. For example, mention something/somebody.
Message. A written or spoken piece of information, etc. that you send to somebody or leave for somebody when you cannot speak to them yourself. For example, there were no messages for me at the hotel.
Mine. Of or belonging to the person writing or speaking. For example, that's mine. More. Used with plural nouns and verbs, especially in negative sentences or in more formal English, to mean a large number of. Also used in questions to ask about the size of a number, and with as, so, and to. For example, we don't have very many copies left.
Most. Used with plural nouns and verbs, especially in negative sentences or in more formal English, to mean a large number of. Also used in questions to ask about the size of a number, and with as, so, and to. For example, we don't have very many copies left.
Much. Used with uncountable nouns, especially in negative sentences to mean a large amount of something, or after how to ask about the amount of something. It is also used with as, so, and to. For example, I don't have much money with me. Much. Used with uncountable nouns, especially in negative sentences to mean a large amount of something, or after how to ask about the amount of something. It is also used with as, so, and to. For example, I don't have much money with me.
My. Of or belonging to the speaker or writer. For example, where's my passport?
Myself. Used when the speaker or writer is also the person affected by an action. For example, I cut myself on a knife.